I got a question. Have you ever asked by whose authority were they allowed to teach this?
Whose authority?
Yeah, the Seventh-day Adventists. No. Who give them the authority to teach that way?
Well, again.
Do they have one central leader?
Somebody named White, isn't it?
Yeah.
Somebody named White.
And he's descended
You gotta, see, this is why it's so imperative to know history. See, when you understand where some of these denominations come from, let me just give you a brief background of Seventh-day Adventists, where they come from. They come from an organization, backtracking Seventh-day Adventists. Before them, there's an organization called the Adventists. This was a denomination, and I believe is in the United States. And their big deal was predicting the end of the world. The Adventist Church. Is that right? Are you familiar with that? They predicted the end of the world. And what would happen, this church would predict, their leaders would predict the end of the world, and the day would come and go, and nothing would happen. So they'd come another date. And then this date would come and go, and they'd come with another date. And this went on several times. And what happened, a lot of the people in their church really got ticked off. Because what they do, they really honestly thought it was the end of the world. They'd sell everything, and they were ready for the end, for Christ to come, and he didn't come, and then they're penniless, you know. So they really got upset. So what happened, the Adventist church, they did this several times, and people got mad at them. So there was a big split. So part of the people went to Seventh-day Adventist. And do you know what the other big split was? Jehovah's Witness.
I didn't know that.
Jehovah's Witness. That's a split off of the Adventist church. And when you study Jehovah's Witness, their big deal was predicting the end of the world. You know their watchtower? Years ago, in the bottom of it, they always had they predicted the end of the world, the end of the world, the end of the world. And a lot of times the same thing with them. The time would come, it never happened. Now ask a Jehovah's Witness, did the end of the world, did Christ ever come? And you know what a Jehovah's Witness is going to tell you? He's going to say, yeah, he came invisibly. That's how the Jehovah's Witness answered their predictions of the end of the world when Christ would come. Now they just say Christ came, but it was an invisible coming. So, it's fascinating to study.
Well.
Yeah, that works.
So where did they get the information or the backing that the Pope was the Antichrist?
Well, they get it. Where do they get the Pope as the Antichrist? Right out of the Bible, in the book of Revelation. You know, because in the book of Revelation it talks about Antichrist. Okay, and and they interpret it to be the Pope. It's their interpretation of the Bible. And again, when the Bible is your only source of authority, who can say you're not right? So, how do we get on Seventh-day? but okay, well, I'll tell you what. We talked about now, they changed it to Sunday, the main worship day, and it was the authority that Christ gave the church for the apostles to change it from Saturday to Sunday. And that's why Christianity now, their main worship day is Sunday. And isn't it interesting? Hey, you want to talk to our non-Catholic friends? Ask them, why do you worship on Sunday? Do you realize that every Christian church that makes their main worship day on Sunday is acknowledging the authority of the Catholic Church?
Oh, cool.
Because it's a Catholic church.
Just like the Bible.
It's a Catholic church, you change it from Saturday to Sunday. This is why I asked my Mormon friend down the street. He hasn't spoken to me for months now. I said, Bill, do you celebrate Christmas? Of course I do. Do you celebrate Easter? Of course I do. They're really anti-Catholic. He says, then I tell him, well, Bill, that's kind of interesting. Do you realize it was the authority of the Catholic Church who established Easter and Christmas?
Oh my.
Well, he certainly knew that.
Most people don't know this. Hey, we're going to celebrate Easter in a few days, folks. Why do we celebrate it on that particular day? Who came up with observing Easter on this particular day? The church. The Catholic Church. And again, remember what I tell you when you're looking in faith? Consistency. There needs to be consistency in all aspects of faith. How can you now accept a church that gives you this, that establishes Christmas and Easter, that changes worship day from Saturday to Sunday, that establishes the doctrine of the Trinity? You accept all these things from this church, but then the other things you reject. The doctrine of the Eucharist, the doctrine of baptism. How do you differentiate? If you believe the church gave you this, what makes it right here and wrong on the definition of the Eucharist?
Because that's their only source.
Either you believe it or you don't. Either you believe the church had authority or you don't. You can't have it both ways. So, you got me in my apologetical mode here. So we just finished the 5th paragraph. Can somebody read that one sentence, 6th paragraph?
The main focus of our worship of Christ is expressed when we celebrate the Eucharist.
The main focus of our worship is expressed when we celebrate the Eucharist. Good old Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, he gives us the reason why we should be celebrating the Eucharist. You know, Paul in Corinthians, he tells us about the bread, the wine, and he says, do this in memory of me. But then he gives us a passage that none of the other gospel writers give us. Well, what does he tell us? In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 26.
For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes.
For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes. How much more meaning does that make when you know Christ is present in the Eucharist, and now you know his sacrifice, his redemption is in the Eucharist? Whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, now you proclaim the death until he comes. You're proclaiming now that sacrifice that he makes present. It gives it so much more meaning, what the Eucharist is all about.
How did Paul know this?
How did Paul know about the Last Supper? Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23. How does Paul start it out? How does Paul know? Was Paul at the Last Supper?
No.
How does Paul know about it? What does the verse say, Cal? Verse 23.
For I received from the Lord what I had handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was handed over, took bread and after he had given and so forth.
For I received from the Lord. How does Paul know about the Last Supper?
Tradition.
All tradition. The apostles told him.
Then he believed them.
How's this for an example of tradition? Ask your people. How did Paul know how to write this? He wasn't at the Last Supper. Oral tradition. You see, Catholics, oral tradition really is authoritative. Paul's using it right here.
Is there some question about him being out in the desert and being taught by the Lord, or whether he was taught by the apostles?
It says that Paul got something from the Lord too, but remember in Paul's conversion story, Paul got knocked off his horse and Jesus appeared to him and he converted. And then a little later on in Acts of the Apostles, Paul stayed with the apostles for a while. The apostles taught him. And remember what gave Paul the authority to go out and spread the good news?
The apostles.
The apostles ordained Paul. Paul spent a lot of time with the apostles, and he was ordained by the apostles, so he got oral tradition.